In 1963, 2 years after our merger to become the Unitarian Universalist Association, the General Assembly took up the issue of racial inclusiveness. The issue at hand was an amendment to the UUA Constitution, the bylaws, that stated that member congregations must, quote, maintain a policy of admitting persons to membership without discrimination of race, color, or national origin if they wanted to maintain their voting rights within the organization. There was controversy over this amendment. That controversy was over congregational polity, the authority that individual congregations have over their own property, the way they govern themselves, the calling of their own ministers, and how they set the standards for membership to their own congregations. It was this point that they argued. Duncan Howlett, the minister of All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C., said, the question before us is not integration. On that, all of us are virtually agreed. The question is how we're going to achieve it in our kind of denomination. In freedom, we shall do it, not by legislation and not by constitutional amendment. Now, it's important to note that Howlett was a longtime civil rights advocate. And you've probably heard me say before, it's not the intention, it's the impact. And that's what was happening here. We had ministers and congregations saying to our siblings of color, well, of course we believe in inclusion. That's not the issue. We just shouldn't put it in our legislation because that conflicts with congregational polity. You understand, of course, right? And that may have been the intention, but it was definitely not the impact. The impact was that our denomination held congregational polity as more important than being radically inclusive. And by the way, the vote did not pass. A weaker resolution reminding congregations of their ethical responsibility passed, but it wasn't the same. 3 years later, in 1966, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. presented the Ware Lecture at the General Assembly in Hollywood, Florida. And he said, one of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, and there could be no gainsaying of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. We see it in other nations in the demise of colonialism. We see it in our own nation in the struggle against racial segregation and discrimination. And as we notice this struggle, we are aware of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our midst. He continued by saying, the idea whose time has come today is the idea of freedom and human dignity. And so all over the world, we see something of a freedom explosion. And this reveals to us that we are in the midst of revolutionary times. An older order is passing away and a new order is coming into being. King encouraged us, and remember, he was speaking to Unitarian Universalists. He encouraged us to 4 specific tasks to stay awake through the revolution. These were to instill a world perspective, to reaffirm the essential immorality of racial segregation, to refute the idea that there are superior and inferior races, and to move into the arena of social action. This was 3 years after we, as Unitarian Universalists, voted against saying in our bylaws that we supported inclusion, that we affirmed the immorality of racial segregation, and that we were moving into the arena of social action. I wonder if any of the people in the room listening to King thought about what happened 3 years earlier. I wonder if King knew what had happened 3 years earlier. And I wonder where we would be as a denomination, as a movement, if we had been brave enough to see that our intentions were not lining up with our impact. Now, I've preached before about how we as Unitarian Universalists have not always lived up to our aspirational principles when it comes to how we interact with our own Unitarian Universalists of color. This is a major issue and one that was taken up by the Commission on Institutional Change for the UUA. The commission was charged at the 2017 General Assembly to conduct an audit of the power structures and analyze systemic racism and white supremacy culture within the UUA. This commission heard a need for a process of truth and reconciliation. Their report, Widening the Circle of Concern, is the beginning of that process. And this report is available on the UUA website, and I encourage every person to read it. The commission first convened a gathering of UU leaders of color, and they were asked in 2017 to share, quote, how the association could continue moving forward in the midst of another racially charged moment. I want to read to you some of the things that were lifted up as issues. These are all quotes from participants. Addressing the perennial problem of race and Unitarian Universalism is not broadly seen as a theological mandate. No shared accountability structures and processes are in place to hold people accountable for the continued harming of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color among us. The diffused nature of our organizations, each with their own accountability structures, means that ignorance and aggression are experienced again and again in different leadership contexts and as leadership changes. Our faith seems to have no room for repentance and saying when we have failed. We need to both learn the lessons of history and acknowledge that these are new times. We lack a consistent analysis of how power works among us and how that power is centered around white, cisgender, heterosexual, and temporarily able-bodied people with means. In 2020, as in 2017, religious professionals of color struggle to maintain their jobs, and many end up deciding to leave or being asked to leave. People of color and others targeted and endangered in this world come into our congregations seeking solace, only to discover that while our beliefs are grounding and life-giving, the way they are practiced in too many of our communities causes harm, confusion, and pain. That's a lot, right? And it can be daunting. But we cannot sleep through this revolution, my friends. Our siblings of color are asking us to do something. We have the opportunity to right the wrongs, to choose impact over intention, to uphold the power of our covenant, and to widen our circle of love. Okay, but how? One way is to ground what we do in our justice work in spiritual or ritual principles. In other words, why are we doing what we're doing? While Unitarian Universalism is a pluralistic faith tradition, which means we have people all along the spectrum of belief, it would be incorrect to say that we don't have a theology. We have a theological history, and our spiritual ancestors sacrificed a lot to leave us a tradition that values both freedom and commitment. Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt said, "We are the theological inheritors of teachings on universal salvation. There is no winnowing out of the supposedly unworthy that can be named sacred among us. It is our very universalism that is at stake when we turn away from the impact that our institutions have on the same communities and groups that society encourages us to dehumanize and make small." The commission, in one of its recommendations around theology, said, quote, "The idea that you can believe anything you want and be a Unitarian Universalist is not valid. We have a theological container within which one can hold a wide range of beliefs about God, about how to practice one's faith, and about how to live. Because we live at the intersection of multiple traditions, defining this container is essential. Because much of the preserved theological work is from white theologians and scholars, we also need to re-engage that work through contemporary lenses." In other words, we need to center the theological work of Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, and scholars of color, both professional and lay, whose knowledge is resonant for our times. We also need to have a stronger understanding of the nature of our covenant. It is vital that we remember we are a covenantal faith, which means when we screw up, when we make mistakes, when we hurt someone, we come back to the table and say, "I'm sorry, I broke our covenant. I want to fix this," and then do the work. It also means that we do the work to be true allies. It means we address and deal with people who are disruptive and causing micro and macro aggressions within our covenantal community, as well as doing that outside of these virtual walls. That means really living our faith and our principles. That means being okay with being uncomfortable. It's not fun to stand up to people we know when they're making comments that can be microaggressions. And the commission recognizes this. They said, quote, "Too often we make decisions based on what generates the least conflict within the majority culture and what allows conformity to continue. tools for encouraging constructive conflict and understanding that our living tradition requires us to always be living into new ways of being are important. I mean, that's easy to do, right? Now, I don't know many people who fully enjoy dealing with conflict. I mean, probably conflict resolution people, but they're a very special kind of people. Challenging the status quo is hard. Challenging white supremacy culture in our society is hard. Challenging the white supremacy culture that we have been steeped in is hard. And challenging and changing the white supremacy culture that sadly is present within our beloved tradition is hard. And all of it is necessary. The commission wrote on their blog in 2018, quote, "Our basic premise is that if we can live into the full participation of those who have been most marginalized among us, we can create a responsive, vibrant Unitarian Universalism, a Unitarian Universalist faith marked by full equity and participation will continue to play a vital role in transforming lives and communities." I have great hope for Unitarian Universalism. I believe we can be a force for good in this world. And I believe we have a lot of work to do. And internally within ourselves, our congregations, and our association. We must do that work before we can really create change in the wider world. 56 years ago, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed we could make this change. He asked us, Unitarian Universalists, to stay awake during the revolution. Sadly, we have been caught napping, but it's not too late. We can wake up. Mark Morrison Reed ends his book, Darkening the Doorways, with the following, and I close with it today. If Unitarian Universalism stands for love, it is wed to freedom. Freedom invites vision. Vision leads to change. Change causes anxiety. Anxiety awakens resistance. Freedom begets vision. Vision leads to change. To embrace change means welcoming someone with an open mind and responding with interest to different behavior or beliefs rather than with a raised eyebrow, a frozen smile, and silence. See that reaction for what it is, a sophisticated way of masking fear. Hold that fear at bay and let your heart lead the way. Change means discomfort, and because of that discomfort, some people will leave. They have in the past, and they will again. Let them go. For those who remain and commit, the discomfort becomes bearable when we recognize that it is for our benefit, that transformation is its result. Healing the systemically transmitted virus that is racism is nothing less than grace. Grace, the moment when we sense within ourselves that something broken has become whole, cannot emerge without freedom. Stasis and control are fierce bastions. Welcoming change means being open and adventuresome. It asks us to celebrate the breadth of theological and social diversity Unitarian Universalism already encompasses, and then to reach beyond it. It means recapturing the excitement we once felt about the new, the wonderment, the curiosity, the openness we knew as children before fear shut it down. It means seeing diversity as a gift we cannot wait to get our hands on. Change will come whether we work for and celebrate it, or distrust and resist it, or simply wait. Our history says it will come whether we want it to or not. For that, we can be thankful. The revolution is here, my friends. It is time to rise up and fight against the systemic white supremacy culture inherent in our nation and sadly within our own denomination. Change is coming whether we're ready or not. Let us be aware of our past. Let us be aware of our own shortcomings. Let us be aware of our impact on others, regardless of our intent. Let us do better and be better. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.